Hello, welcome back to the channel. When I first started this channel, I definitely was doing different stuff to what I'm doing now. Not that one thing is objectively better than the other, but I was more focused on general apologetics and to some extent touching on the culture and on things that I think were non-denominational issues within Christianity. And in this video, I want to talk about Christian nationalism. I've touched on this idea a couple times in my older videos, but I have a lot more new subscribers than I did when I made those videos. So I'm going to kind of readdress a lot of the feelings and thoughts and things that I was talking about in those videos. One of the things that I'm fairly convicted of is this relationship called the cognitive behavioral cycle, which is this idea that I think in the modern world especially, and this can kind of happen in my opinion in the Christian world too, as we take the supposition that we act after we believe. We think about what we want to do, and then our actions are a result of our thoughts and our feelings. And our feelings and beliefs and our system of understanding is prior to our actions and behaviors. But this isn't what the data bears out. And most psychologists have been able to recognize this for a long time, and this is pretty much the consensus of what's called the cognitive behavioral cycle. What does that mean? Well, people do things, and then the things that they do actually inform their beliefs. So this is why rituals can be so important, because what rituals do is they make you act out things, and then through acting them out, your mind adjusts to the beliefs associated with that ritual. So if, say, I'm afraid of going into an elevator, I have this fear that I'm going to get in the elevator and a bunch of bad stuff's going to happen. The way that a cognitive behavioral therapist would address these issues they would tell you slowly approach the elevator, get used to doing stuff with the elevator, and then eventually you're going to have to go in the elevator before your fear is gone, and only through actually getting in the elevator and doing the thing that you're afraid of will you lose the fear of it. And this is obvious with fears, but the same thing is true about beliefs. So in the Christian world, I think what ends up happening a lot of times is you'll get people who start to act like unbelievers, or they act like non-Christians, and then slowly the beliefs follow. What do I mean by this? Tons of priests will talk about this, or pastors will talk about this. They have a very faithful congregant, and then the congregant is like, hey, I need to meet up with you, I'm having doubts. And if you ask them, did you fall into sexual sin most of the time, and did that prompt this? A good percentage of them, if not all, will say, oh yeah, I did something, even if it's not a sexual sin, they did something that they thought was irreconcilable with their Christian faith, and then the doubts start to follow. Now, is this the case all the time? No, and of course there is the idea that our beliefs do affect our actions, but just recognizing that it goes both ways, and that there's this cycle here, that the things that we do start to live themselves out in our minds. And this is why I think we'll talk about this throughout the rest of the presentation, but this is why a secular culture has become so hazardous to Christian faith. Not because of the arguments, not because of the beliefs entirely, but also because we go to this secular space where the illusion was we would sit in that secular space and we would all have our separate religious beliefs, and then we would go home and have our religious beliefs. But as that religious space, secular space, has gotten more and more aggressively secular, and aggressively, basically, practically atheistic, right? Now versus when at the beginning of the founding fathers, all of the people practicing secularism were Protestant Christians. So when they came to the space where they agreed to, quote unquote, leave their religion behind, it was a vaguely similar presuppositions in their back of their head about God and the Bible and morality and things like that. But as our society has gotten broader and broader and wider and has been more and more accepting of other views, the things that we consider secular has also broadened, which means that effectively we all have to act like atheists, that we don't believe in anything spiritual in public. Think about the rules against public schools and things like this. What this does is it doesn't actually create, some very powerful argument against Christianity for people, but it does make people begin to act like secular, basically act like atheists, and then eventually the thoughts follow. So they start to believe in atheism because they haven't acted it out. And actually, for a lot of people, I think coming back into Christianity, coming back into faith from movements like the Jordan Peterson movement, a big jump for so many of them is it was hard for them to actually believe in God. But once, and this is the case for me, I have a friend who this is very similar, and I know there are many people I've spoken to online who this is their similar case. Once they started acting like they believed in God, and once they started praying, once they started going to church, once they started, going to confession for depending on the denomination, then they started to actually feel the presence of God in their life. Then they started to believe because they were acting as if God was real. Then it all started to make practical sense to them in a way that closed the gap between their intellectual understanding of God and this real feeling of belief. And I think that that's something that it's hard for people to recognize today in a way that wasn't before. In most human societies, the ritual, the liturgy, we might call it in the Christian world, was a huge part of Christianity. And thinking that we would have Christianity without the liturgy, without the ritual, was just patently absurd. This is why we had things like, calendars and saints' days. And this is why it was important for us to consider the saints, to consider the people who had gone before us, so that we could have this broader influence on our society that came from shared rituals, which are going away more and more and more in our society. What's, I think, interesting as someone who's theologically literate or someone who really likes theology is you start to see this debate between belief and actions and this dichotomy between belief and actions. Then you start to think, in the Christian world especially, okay, what does this have to do with justification by faith alone? Because is it really just our belief, or do the works have a role to play in our salvation? And then when you start to think about it like this, I think some of that, for instance, Peter's epistles, where he's talking about the regular habits you have to have faith, it's not as clear of a, I might get in trouble for this, but it's not as clear of a linear relationship between faith and the activities, faith and the works. Sometimes the works themselves maintain our faith. And so there's that kind of cyclical relationship there. So when you start to ask questions about what the formal cause of justification is, practically, and again, we can have arguments about from the cosmological perspective, from God's perspective, everything's predestined, but from our earthly perspective, what's the formal cause of our justification? What are the things we have to do to kind of help ourselves? Well, these rituals do play a big role in the things we believe, and if faith, you might say, is the thing that justifies us, then this dichotomy starts to, I think, break down a little bit in practice. Now, what this does is, I think if you start to realize this, it might reshape some of the conversations that were going on in the Protestant world at the time. This is the interesting thing, at least in my perspective, that so many of us wrestle with in an academic way in this part of Christian YouTube, that I think is interesting to think about. So, for instance, Protestant Reformation. There's the debate between Lutherans and like Chemnitz and like the Catholic world, and there's this, and we can debate about how to hash out the different perspectives as accurately as possible. But there was this issue that Martin Luther and some of his successors have, where it felt like the monastic tradition, monks, there were all kinds of monks. Luther was himself a monk. That it was being billed to these monks that in some way their actions, their life of monastic order was justifying them, that it was doing something to make them right in the eyes of God, that it was playing a role in their own salvation. And the Lutherans had a problem with this, and all the other Protestants, of course, had a problem with this portrayal. Now, in the Catholic world, there wasn't as much of a clean narrative, I would say, especially at the time, about what was actually going on with the monk. How are they actually contributing to the salvation of others? You get into these conversations about the saints, too, because people will say, oh, it's heretical to say, for instance, Mary saves us, because Mary doesn't save us. The only person who saves us is Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ is who we have faith in, and our faith is who we believe is what saves us. Boom. But when you start to have, I think, this non-dichotomous understanding that our belief in Christ can in some way be reinforced by the actions, by the rituals we're participating in, by the system of being that we're surrounded by that includes activities of the saints, that salvation starts to have less of this clear, a narrative. And this is just a perspective, a way of looking at it. Even if you don't agree with that framing, this is just a way of looking at it that's different than the Protestant way of looking at it, about belief immediately causing justification in some sense. But what might be actually true is if you look at, for instance, Saint Benedict, who was an early Western monk who really helped start the monastic tradition in the West. I think it's interesting that his the order of St. Benedict has kind of been reappropriated in our society, and I think we'll see this come back up later in this conversation itself about what this means, or what exactly St. Benedict was doing. Because St. Benedict was living in a time he considered particularly debaucherous, and the society around him was kind of living an unchristian way. And so what he did was he didn't fully retreat from the society, but he created these communities of people dedicated to what? Living out the Christian life. And in that way, it was able to revitalize Christian life for Christians, and eventually in the culture, the broader culture, as well. And this is kind of what Rod Dreher proposes in the Benedict option, is this idea that Christians shouldn't kind of participate in a full retreat from culture, but just that we should have these enclaves in society where we are engaging other Christians that reinforce our faith, reinforce our beliefs, and contextualize, in a way, our beliefs. And what monks were doing for Christian society for so long was participating in this cog. If beliefs inform actions, actions inform beliefs, actions inform beliefs, beliefs inform actions, the people around us provide an environment for this spinning cog, and they contextualize our actions, and they make the things that we do different, and they inspire our actions. And if those actions in some ways inform our beliefs and kind of precipitate belief, or reinforce belief, or establish what's going on, having those enclaves of dedicated Christian life actually kind of put a bunch of good cogs in this web of cogs of our society that are kind of helping us all reroute and redirect and spin us in the right direction, you might say. What this starts to do is it starts to point to conversations about, I would say, what you might call emergent properties, and a way of thinking about the church and the Holy Spirit and how we're being acted is as an emergent property. Now, what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is when Jesus says to his disciples that whenever 2 or 3 are gathered there I am with them. There's this idea that together Christians do something different than we do by ourselves. There's something we're incapable of doing by ourselves that we need other people for. And in sociology, or in metaphysics, and in, I would say, the broader philosophical YouTube space in general, I'm stealing this particularly from Paul Vanderklay in a conversation he had with Benjamin Boyce, is the idea of emergent properties. Now, what is an emergent property? Well, a good example of this, I think, is the idea of wetness. So is one molecule of water wet? Not exactly, but when you put 2 molecules of water together, or you attach water to another thing, you get this property of there's a wetness being shared between these things. Maybe that's not the best example, but there's this idea that when 2 things interact, they create a new property that's not particular to either of them. There's this idea that something is more than the sum of its parts. It has a character unique to the combination and not just to the thing itself. In fact, emergent properties actually are a physical fact, because if you looked at all of the atoms in the world that look very diverse and boiled them all down, they're all made of the same parts. They're all made out of protons, neutrons, and electrons. But in combination, and in different combination, the effects of those constituent parts of atoms have different elements that they manifest. And then those elements, when they make molecules, when they come together, create completely unique effects that aren't really just, oh, it's more elementy, or it's more, proton-y. They create unique effects, emergent properties that come through the interplay of different things. And this is what culture is, right? This is the idea that human beings create these characters and they animate these things in our society without thinking about it. We have these ideas, and if we share an idea with somebody else, that idea becomes more real than if we had just had it in our bedroom someday. I would say this is basically how the ancient world conceptualized of things like fire. So fire is this idea. It's also this thing that happens to you. But in some broader sense, there's this like spirit of fire. There's this way that fire relates to human beings. There's this way we conceptualize fire. And they would, in ancient culture, in ancient Greece and the Middle East or whatever, there would also be a god of fire that in some way personified this spirit of fire that lived in their society, that influenced their society, that the expectations for fire could be discussed in a narratival way, and in a way that we actually understand. Because contrary to the great scholastic traditions of our societies, we actually don't experience the world as an essay. We experience the world in a narrative sense, as a narrative. And so the best way to convey ideas a lot of the times can be as a narrative and can be as a story. And so the stories have characters, and the things you want to talk about become characters, that kind of way of thinking. And so that's a natural human process of culture, and therefore also religions in a sense. What does this have to do with the Bible or Christianity? Christians don't claim that their God is just this manifestation. Well, Christians don't. Maybe people like Jordan Peterson do, but we don't claim that our God is just this manifestation of human emergent properties or anything like that. I'm not saying that. That is not what Christianity believes or says. But there are actually sub-themes within the scriptures which take advantage of this natural human tendency. They use the language of the ancient cultures around them. They use the ways of human mind-making to talk about these things. And one of the key themes, and I just did a video about this in relationship to infant baptism, but one of the key ideas in the Bible is this concept of headship. In 1 Corinthians, we see Paul talking about the people participating in the Exodus event as being under Moses or in Moses. And elsewhere in the epistles, it's talked about the sons of Abraham, who is in Abraham, who has Abraham as their father. And there's this idea that there are all these different types of headship. Additionally, there is the headship of Adam, which is replaced by the headship of Christ over all of humanity. What does this mean? Well, human beings tend to organize themselves by activities. Think about, I'm going to read this now, but think about the way that Paul is demonstrating that they have Moses as their head, as their leader, as their spiritual head. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Now, what he's saying is, look at all these things they participated in together. This is a narrative. This is why Exodus is at the heart, in a lot of ways, of the entire Bible, is it's this typological summit of a narratival fact that is going to be played out a million times elsewhere in Scripture and in other events and again in the life and fulfilled in the life of Jesus, which is what makes the Bible so powerful when you realize all of these connections. But ultimately what Paul is saying here is they were baptized, they went through this water experience together, they followed a cloud, they passed through the sea, they ate the same food, they drank the same drinks, and they participated, the water that they drank came from the same spiritual rock. And the way that he talks about these things is the spiritual versions of these things. I think what this gets at is that there are lots of Christians and atheists who try to take the Bible as just a history book. The whole point of the book is just to tell you what factually happened in history. And that's not the whole point of the book. It might be a point of the book. There's definitely lots of history in the Bible. But the majority of it is a spiritual guidebook on how to live our lives. And so if you read the Exodus story and all you take out of it is that you have to date back the years until there was slavery in Egypt and then write that in your history book, you've missed something crucial about the Exodus story, which is this typology, this story, and all these things. And what would subsequently happen is the New Testament plays off of those typologies established in the Old Testament. This isn't the only time that, for instance, baptism is compared to going through the Red Sea. Peter does the same thing. Peter also compares baptism to what happens in Noah. He tells us baptism is like the ark that Noah was in, that saved him from the flood against sin. In Jude, you see this that there was a Jesus who saved you, who took you out of Egypt and into the promised land, and in the promised land he destroyed the evil ones, the ones who were doing evil. And of course, when he's talking about Jesus there, he's using the Greek word for the name Yeshua, which is the same name as for Joshua, who's the biblical character who leads the Israelites into Canaan, and Jesus, who was also named Yeshua, and that's just the Greek thing that's going on there. So what he's saying is you can draw a parallel between you're supposed to draw parallels and learn about Jesus through the typologies established prior to Jesus in these Old Testament stories. And the same thing happens in Christian cultures after the canonization of the Bible, after the widespread acceptance and the foundational element of the Bible in our social societies. A great example of this is the story of King Arthur, and it's playing with all of these motifs from Christianity. Not only, I mean, infamously, the Holy Grail is supposed to be the cup from the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, but also this idea that the way we know Arthur is a king is he takes a sword from a stone. And we can see in Corinthians here and all throughout Scripture, the idea of the rock, is Jesus. Jesus is the cornerstone of civilization. He is the king above all kings. So his role of monarchy is associated with this rock. It's not an arbitrary storytelling device that the sword, which signifies Arthur's royalty, comes from the rock, right? That the rock is the foundation of Arthur's kingship. And this is, by the way, in my opinion, people always ask me, as someone who loves the King Arthur stories, and I can talk about them forever, people always ask, why do you think there hasn't been any good Arthur movies? Why are all the King Arthur movies today not very good? And it's because if you actually read, like, Le Morte d'Arthur, which is one of the most full versions of the Arthur story by Thomas Mallory, it's racked. It's soaked through with Christian imagery. There are angels that show up. There is the idea of heaven and earth. Galahad, who's supposed to be this paragon of virtue, is ever virgin, and he doesn't want to touch evil. What's his great reward at the end of the story for finding the Grail? It's not earthly glory, but it's heavenly glory. He immediately wants to die and be in union with Christ. So when you try to take out all these elements from the original King Arthur story, because that was the foundation of that story, the King Arthur stories and the movies, or the sensational versions we get, start to be really hollow and meaningless. And I think the same thing happens to the Jesus story for lots of Christians today when they aren't immersed in this context, this typology, this context that the Old Testament provides, and all of these typological fulfillments that occur at the cross and in Jesus. This is what I think the value of Jordan Peterson has been, is that he's been giving that typological context to so many Americans who were either quasi-Christian or atheistic, who didn't see this value. There's a clip that always makes me laugh where Jordan Peterson explains the story of Jonah and the symbolism and the value of the story and the meaning of the story to Bill Maher, and Bill Maher laughs, who's infamously an atheist, if you don't know, and he says, okay, well, but how many Christians do you think about that story in that way? And I don't know if that says more about Bill Maher or about Christians, that Bill Maher could just assume that Christians don't think about the meaning, the significance, the symbols, the lessons for our lives from Bible stories. But that is the point of these stories, is they do provide that context. They provide that, like I was saying before with the monks or the environment, these stories, these ways of thinking put us in a place. And in some sense, these actions and these beliefs put us under the headship of an idea, of a character who manifests, right, this context or manifests these concepts. That's how someone can speak of being under Moses, baptized into Moses. Because Moses is the amalgamation of this story. He's the personification of the Exodus story. He's the main character, and the other characters are in some sense participating in Moses through participating in the actions of this story. And in that sense, in the eyes of God, are also justified by Moses, if that makes sense, or justified in Moses. As when Moses is righteous, they are righteous. In 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 4, it's followed by 1 through 5, where it says, and God was displeased with most of the Israelites. And despite that, we know, obviously if you read Exodus, that he still takes them to the promised land. Moses, who is mostly, of all of the Old Testament characters, is the least problematic. Even Moses, though, is not perfect. He's not a perfect head. He's flawed, and he strikes the rock infamously, and we can have a whole video about that. But basically, he loses God's favor. He doesn't justify himself by his works. That's a whole other conversation. He loses, he has that moment of wavering faith in God and trusting God. And because of it, he is not worthy to enter the promised land. And in fact, many of the people in the Israelites aren't, and a generation of them has to die in the desert. That's a whole other conversation. I will eventually do a video on Exodus, but regardless, there's this idea of living out this character who animates our society. And in some ways, that was Moses for the Exodus characters. That was Abraham for the entire Jewish people, or Israel, whom all of the Israelites are even named after, is one man, which means to wrestle with God, of course. And then King Arthur. And the reason this is such a great story is because to some extent, England, as it emerges as a country and as a national identity, has this King Arthur character who starts to manifest himself. If you look into the history of the Arthur character, Originally, he's maybe a Welsh general or something, barely of note, who shows up in a couple of chronicles as a skilled general, slowly evolves into a king. But as England begins to emerge as a country and as a nation, they adopt this King Arthur character, who's the king of the Britons, right? This universal character who seems to be mimicking or have had some kind of similar political authority to what the kings of England have. And they adopt him as a character, and then by the time of Sir Thomas Malory, if you want to tell a story about England, it has to involve King Arthur. It has to involve the Knights of the Round Table. It has to involve all these things. And you continue to amass all of this imagery and this kind of idea of nationhood. And these nations are the environment by which we have context for our beliefs and actions, and they inform our beliefs and they inform who we are in ways that are actually crucial to our lives and not tertiary or not non-incidental. In a lot of ways, you can see today with controversial issues like Palestine and Israel, you do see a lot of people who have this kind of knee-jerk association with one side or the other, and it's people who will try to, I think, mistakenly try to tally up this is what this side has done, that's what this side has done, you should be on this side because of that reason, are missing in the obvious undercurrent of lots of conflicts, which are really just, I am with Team B. I've done with these things with Team B. I eat, sleep, and drink with Team B. The personification of Team B is animated and within me and is taking over in a way that I don't really have, free will over. I don't have control over. It's not really a conscious choice. I can't just change my beliefs and then my actions will follow. Instead, I'm immersed in this, and my beliefs are a requisite product of the thing I'm immersed in. Right, and these movements, this headship has a life of its own that destroys, in some sense, individual agency to some extent, not completely. But you see this with these kinds of movements and the things that happen, and of course, people will say, "Oh, XYZ would never do this," and then of course, in 10 years they do this because the idea is animating them more than some kind of logic or reason. It's an entailment of a life of a character, of a personification living itself out through this group of people. And that's basically how nations work. I think of Charlemagne as a great example of this for France. There's this kind of idea, or even of the Holy Roman Empire, or even just of all of Europe. He's this father of Europe, he's sometimes called. And his story, his characters, then you get on the continent, like just with King Arthur, like I was saying before, you get like, okay, well, I'm going to have this knightly character that I want to write my story about. His name is going to be Roland. I'll put him in King Arthur, in Charlemagne's court, because Charlemagne is, in that some sense, the father. And if you look at royal family trees, you can see most people with European ancestry, even, people, you can point it out more clearly with royal people because you have their entire family lineage marked out. But actually, most people with any European ancestry can trace their lineage back to Charlemagne because of, in some sense, he's literally the father of Europe. Think about the parallels this might have with a character like Abraham in the Bible. He's literally the father, but also spiritually the father. He has this headship. His ideas animate the society. And the ideas live out through these people. So when Napoleon comes to office, he has to play into a lot of the Charlemagne archetypes. In some way, Napoleon also ends up becoming this, replacing Charlemagne as the father figure of France, but those are conversations for other times. Think also about in the fall of the Roman Republic. Brutus, who was a nephew, or a pseudo-nephew, or a close figure with Julius Caesar, because he's named after an ancient character in the history of Rome, Lucius Junius Brutus, who infamously killed the last king of Rome and instituted the Republic. He kills a tyrant, institutes a republic. There's this idea in the air while Brutus is around that he's going to kill Julius Caesar before he even does, because everyone feels like he has to live out this animation of this name, this idea, this person, this headship that has power over him. And of course, in real life, Brutus does kill Julius Caesar, and does repeat the effect of what his namesake did. And of course, this coin, I think, is a great example of it, because when Brutus takes political control and starts minting coins to legitimize himself and his faction, who does he put on the coin but his historic ancestor and namesake, who killed a tyrant and instituted the Republic? And these characters, these people, these headships, these names have tons of power over us in ways that we don't always recognize. Think also, by the way, about how King Arthur in the story, there's the round table. There's this idea that there's not actually a head of the table. Obviously, King Arthur's the king, but the knights at the table are in some way equal. And think about how Anglo-Saxons and English people, Englishmen historically, have reinterpreted that as a type of English priority of equality in some sense, or dignity. Ignominy is the word that's coming to mind, but I'm not sure that's the right word. But the idea that these knights are all equivalent. There's not a hierarchy or a ranking among them, and you get this kind of English tradition of parliamentary democracy kind of read back into the Knights of the Round Table story. And now, whether or not that is actually legitimate living out of this myth that was, a mustard seed, you might say, in the Knights of the Round Table story, or if it's a attempt to reconcile this national idea with the way that Englishmen conceive of themselves in the modern era, is up to debate. But you get this idea that this story has to have some significance to the way that England actually is, that the way that England actually sees itself has to be an element of these stories. This also is again, to return to the context of the people in this sphere of Christian YouTube. I can't tell you how many people I know that have become Catholic, or for instance, there's infamous stories about people on Ben Shapiro's staff who became Catholic. And was it the arguments that made them become Catholic? Not so much. What it is, and this, I don't mean this in a cynical way, I think this is a powerful evangelistic tool. This is kind of the point I'm trying to make with this presentation. But a lot of people become Catholic because they just start binge watching Pints with Aquinas, and they want to be part of this group of people. There's a quote from Cameron Bertuzzi of him before he was Catholic, and he had this whole scandal, of course, where he became Catholic, where he admits that part of him wants to just kind of be in the cool squad with Trent Horn and Matt Fradd and Scott Hahn and Jimmy Aiken and all these people he's regularly interacting with, and that interaction, that environment, changed his beliefs slowly over time. And I think people want to find quotes like that and to make it seem like that means Cameron's conversion was ingenuine, but that's not true. I think the silly part of that is that the conversion is genuine because of all of those reasons. It's not genuine. That this is how our minds work. This is how humans are made, because we were made to be interacting with each other. Adam, in some sense, wasn't complete until Eve was made. He couldn't create on his own in the image of God. What is God? God's a creator, but God creates man in his image, and man can only create when he's complemented by a woman. So in some sense, we fulfill our own rightful role in creation through each other, so it's only natural that our interactions with other people inform who we are, our identity, our beliefs, our practices, and all these things. It's an intention, and it's really powerful. And this is kind of how what a nation is, right? A nation is, in some sense, you have yourself as a cog, and by cog I literally mean, it's a double pun, right? Because you're spinning, right, like a cog, and then there's the cognitive behavioral cycle. So the cognitive behavioral cycle makes you all cog, right? And so you're doing your little spinning here. You're a Christian, and you're acting out Christianity, and you're influencing this stuff. And then so there's another cog that's going to kind of butt heads with you. And if you're spinning in the same direction, you're going to start spinning faster in the same direction. But if they're spinning in another direction, you're going to have this problem, this disconnect, right? And what's going to happen if you guys are left alone, right, in an uncomplicated space, is maybe one of you will win out and influence the other, whichever one was spinning faster, maybe. But in reality, our societies are, an array of these cogs all going on all at once. And so for there to be institutions, people naturally gravitate towards people who agree with them, because you get less of that friction. And then you start to get like a church, basically. All the people in this community who are Christians meet up every week. And not only do they meet up every week, usually churches have activities throughout the week, and they do lots of things together that reinforce each other's beliefs. And there's this idea that will kind of become an influence on the broader community through association with each other and strengthening of each other. And there are other institutions in society that work the same way. We all like golf, so the way we can keep our interest in golf is by going golfing together pretty regularly. And those institutions then interact with bigger institutions, bigger clusters of cogs, and then eventually you form this kind of national identity out of the amalgamation of these institutions, because in a healthy society, basically there are some cogs we all share. And when we share all those cogs, when we have some going in different directions, maybe I like golfing, but we're all Christians, and you don't like golfing, you like basketball. The healthy amount of conflict between the cogs creates more motion. It creates this is the metaphor is starting to escape me, of course, but the idea is that there's a healthy amount of diversity, and then there's an unhealthy amount of diversity, which I think we all kind of feel like we're experiencing now, which I think is one of the factors drawing more and more young people to religion, is this idea that, oh, geez, we can't agree on anything anymore in our society because we were told, basically, that a healthy cog is an isolated cog. What do I mean by this? Well, there's this idea that we've been fed, I would say, since Disney movies immemorial, is that there's a secret version of you that is just waiting to break out. And if you let that version of you break out, by detaching yourself from the pressures of other people, you'll finally be at peace. You'll finally accept yourself for who you are. But this negates the fact that the way we make ourselves, the way we understand ourselves, is actually only through other people. And that when we do this process by ourselves, we're bound to become a cog spinning completely against the grain. And when we do spin completely against the grain, when we try to reintegrate into society, we find ourselves isolated and lonely and depressed. And you can't get along, and there's no reason to go outside. I think this is why we see, for instance, young people resorting not to dating. The biggest thing I hear when I tell people that I'm young and I'm married is they're like, oh, you're so lucky. I can't find anybody who has the same values as me, who wants the same things as me. And that's left, right, center. All kinds of persuasions of people are having more and more difficulty today finding a spouse, finding a long-term partner, finding that they are even capable in and of themselves of making that kind of commitment. Why? Because the fear is, I'm a cog spinning all these things, and I have all these secret cogs in my body, all these secret things that I'm the real me, and if I really let that real me out, they would reject it. Because it's so random, it's so weird, it's so disconnected with broader society. And the way that humans were made, in some sense, wasn't to leave those parts of us unguarded, but was kind of to let those things out, those things to be vulnerable with other people, and then in that interaction, though, evolve, right? I think that the fear is, I don't want to change this special thing about me, so I can't let them know, because we all know that if we let that special thing out of us, that secret thing that we're really worried about, that secret behavior, that secret belief, that secret thing about us, that we'll have to change it. And we don't want to change it. But change, in this sense, is very healthy. And actually, it's what helps our society function as a corporate amalgamation of a number of individuals. It's actually miraculous that people create societies, that we work together long enough to have an economy, right? Or have a workspace. But doing that has a lot of social capital, which I think we don't really train ourselves for anymore. Now, what do we do now? And this is kind of one of maybe my more creative ideas, and we'll talk about this in a second, but there's this idea that in history that there have been people exiled from their rightful role. And this is in stories, but this is also in history as itself, like in actually played itself out in history, right? We were talking before about the dichotomy between real, quote-unquote, real history and metaphorical history and symbolic history. But we find that, I think, if you study history, those things aren't as much of a clear dichotomy anymore. Charles II, who eventually would be the married monarch of England, all that kind of stuff, his dad is the one who was beheaded. He leaves England to eventually, hopefully, one day reclaim the throne while there's a quote-unquote commonwealth or republic in England. But while he's abroad, while he's in the Netherlands and France, he still calls himself king, even though he's not actually king. And he has a court, and he has ballroom dances at his own expense, and he racks up all this credit. He has to get all these people to loan him money to do all this. But basically, he has to pretend to be king while he's not king. And why is this important? Well, when he comes back to England and does take on the kingship, he's basically used to it at that point. And he knows how to play the king for people. Charles eventually goes to Scotland to rally an army. And when he's there, he knows what it in some sense, not perfectly, not as well as if he'd actually been the real deal, but in some sense he knows what it is to be king. He knows what it's like to be king, and people believe they can see him in that role. And so I think as we are in a society that increasingly fails at the rituals and fails at roles and fails at all of these things that are crucial to our social development, we actually have to model them in ways that are going to feel and do feel oftentimes fake, right? Like I was saying before, but the people who are inquiring into Christianity often come to me and they say, "Oh, but I don't really feel like I believe you." And my advice always is start acting like you do, because then you will. And the same thing I think is going to be true about Christian institutions and Christian culture. You might be at this point saying, okay, how is this about Christian nationalism? I saw the thumbnail, I clicked on this video, and I thought this was going to be about Christian nationalism. And we'll be talking about that in a second. The American Revolution, by the way, is the same thing. I totally forgot about this slide. In America, we wanted a democracy. What would make the American Revolution different than other revolutions, right? Like the French Revolution. Why was the French Revolution so much worse than the American Revolution? Well, the American Revolution wanted to install basically a non-monarchical parliament, which had been being practiced in England for a long time, and basically adopted many of the state governments, for instance, adopted governance styles from corporations, charters that had started this colonial process. So the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was their democratic body or the semi-democratic body that ruled the colony of Virginia, was originally a colonial charter. It was really originally a company, right? There was this idea that you have all these stockholders who have a say in a company. You can look into corporate law if you want to, but that's still how they work today. And they vote. And there's this idea of shareholder democracy. So then when America becomes a country, we adopt basically the system of government we've already been doing in the colonies and in the states, which is this idea of shareholder democracy. So you get the idea, okay, if you have a piece of property in America, you can vote. You're a shareholder in this idea of a country that we just kind of created. And in some sense, you get a lot of myth-making that starts to come about as America becomes a nation to fill in the imaginative gaps of our country. Think of characters like Mark Twain and stuff, and I can do a whole lecture on that. But basically, it's the idea that they were playing at something that eventually they did in reality, and it made that transition smooth and non-violent. If we today, I think I see a lot of people talking about Christian nationalism this, Christian nationalism that. You get people like Doug Wilson, who kind of has his thing in Moscow, Idaho, and you have this, we'll kind of go do our own separate thing because the culture around us is falling apart. And then you get on the reverse, my good friend Redeem Zoomer has all this stuff about Reconquista, which a lot of people are very excited about, which is this idea that, okay, Protestant mainline churches are basically, in some ways, the epicenter, the creation space of a lot of the ideas that are destroying our society. So what should we do? These are valuable institutions. Well, there's two attitudes. There's the retreat one I was talking about before, and then he's got this idea of Reconquista. Why? Well, these societies, I don't think it's a coincidence the mainline is dying because they have adopted that attitude I was talking about before, which in the institutions slide, where it's like, okay, we're all going to be our secret sacred self. We don't have to abide by, there's fewer and fewer rules of Christianity. The rituals are more and more empty in Christianity. And then you find, okay, well, now we're literally not even reproducing because it's harder to find a spouse in a world where everyone's being their secret sacred self and we're all drifting away into our own individualistic bubbles of our exact interests and our exact lifestyles. And so the same thing is happening in the mainline churches. They're dwindling. No one's coming anymore. They're all dying out. So the hope was these evangelical conservative churches can kind of come back in and take over from the inside in the same way that radical liberal, and lowercase l liberal, right, liberal theologian, people took over these denominations in the first place. And there's pluses and minuses to this idea. But mostly, I think it's interesting from a Christian nationalism perspective because it mirrors that question of, okay, what does a Christian nationalism look like? Does it look like us taking over the U.S. government and imposing Christianity on everybody? Or does it look like us kind of doing our own thing separate from everybody else and kind of maybe seeking a second way or second thing? And what I've called this in some of my older videos that I might talk about now is this idea of nation B. Why do I call it nation B? Well, there's this understanding of there's nation A. There's the right way you're supposed to do things, and we all kind of know this. It's like this kind of live and let live attitude, the very pro LGBTQ stuff, the cancel culture, and if you don't participate in nation A, that's where cancel culture comes in. You get this strong feeling that you're leaving the country, you're leaving what you're supposed to be saying in public, and the people who and people that disagree with this nation A consensus, in some sense, I think are kind of coming to a breaking point. Do I leave nation A or do I assimilate? And some people assimilate, but I think most people basically just exit. And there's all these people that were valuable members of institutions that used to be like new atheists or whatever, who as they're getting kicked out of nation A are kind of stumbling into nation B. This is why you get all these people who were new atheists who are now Christians or who are not anti-Christian. You get people like, I would say Sargon of Akkad is a great example of this, who was originally, like a new atheist, doesn't like conservatives kind of guy. Now he's like kind of very classical conservative even. I think he called himself a classical liberal, but in a lot of sense he's basically Edmund Burke, if not more conservative than Edmund Burke. And what's happening, I think, is we're seeing the problems with nation A, and so a second nation is being subtly created. And what is that nation going to look like, I think, is the question we're all asking. And my answer is, I think in some sense, it's going to have that headship, that architecture. It's going to have to understand the rituals of creating a country, of creating an identity that we've lost. And I think we all subtly know this. This is why I think people like Jonathan Peugeot are so popular. I think people are really afraid of the term Christian nationalism in lots of ways, because it's a loaded term, it has lots of associations. Lots of people have their thing they want to associate with Christian nationalism, about their own movement, about their own thing. But I would try to challenge that kind of natural skepticism and kind of rebut it with the idea that in some sense Christians have always been Christian nationalists. And this is an excerpt from the Epistle to Diognetus. The Epistle to Diognetus was written around about 100 years after the death of Jesus, and I think it's very representative of the attitude early Christians had. You can see similar stuff like this in less explicit ways in the New Testament, but in more explicit ways in things like the Shepherd of Hermas and all these kinds of things. Let me just read this section from the Epistle to Diognetus. For the Christians are distinguished from other men, neither by country, nor language, nor the customs which they observe. For they neither inhabit cities of their own, nor employ a peculiar form of speech, nor lead a life which is marked out by any singularity. The course of conduct which they follow has not been devised by any speculation or deliberation or of inquisitive men, nor do they, like some, proclaim themselves the advocates of any merely human doctrines, but inhabiting Greek as well as barbarian cities, according as the lot of each of them has determined, and following the customs of the natives in respect to clothing, food, and the rest of their ordinary conduct, they display to us their wonderful and confessedly striking method of life. They dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. As citizens, they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as if foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, and every land of their birth is a land of strangers. They marry, as do all others. They beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws, and at the same time surpass the laws by their lives. They love all men, and are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death and restored to life. They are poor, yet make many rich. They are in lack of all things, and yet abound in all. They are dishonored, and yet in their very dishonor are glorified. They are evil spoken of, and yet are justified. They are reviled and blessed. They are insulted, and repay the insult with honor. They do good, yet are punished as evildoers. When punished, they rejoice as if quickened into life. They are assailed by the Jews as foreigners, and are persecuted by the Greeks. Yet those who hate them are unable to assign any reason for their hatred. There's this idea that goes way back, and if you read the rest of the epistle, the author talks a lot about how Christians are the soul of the world. There's this idea that we're citizens of a heavenly country, and in all these other places we're sojourners, like the land of our birth and all these kinds of things. But the reason that this uses a term of nationhood goes back to the Old Testament. The Jews don't just kind of live as atomized individuals, but instead as a nation, as a kingdom. When God talks about his plan to remake the earth and perfect creation, it's called the kingdom of heaven. And it has all of these ways of relating to each other. The reason I really like this epistle is because it's the person asking the question, Diognetus, who originally wrote to this person, asked, how do Christians worship? And the first half of this letter is the author describing how Greeks worship and why that's wrong, and how Jews worship and why that's wrong. But then when he starts to describe how Christians worship their God, he doesn't start, he does talk about this, but he doesn't start with like the liturgy or Sunday meeting or the sacraments as much, but instead about the way they live their lives and how their lives are transformed, and how when just the way they live their life is so set apart from the other people of the world, but from the Greeks, the barbarians, and the Jews. And I think there's something that we can learn about that now in a way that speaks to the questions today that we're having about so-called Christian nationalism and nationhood. And what does this mean? What does this kind of architecture of Christianity look like today? I hope this video was helpful. I hope it makes sense. I hope I spoke possibly to something that you were already thinking about or weren't thinking about, but maybe could have been. Because these are the things we're wrestling with today. And I think it's easy to get distracted by interdenominational issues about how to read XYZ passage when this stuff is really important. Not that those other things aren't important. Not that theology isn't important, and I'll continue to make videos on theology. But we have a deeper wound to address, I would say. And I hope that this can kind of articulate that well. If you liked the video, give it a like. If you agree, if you disagree, make a comment in the comment section. If you want to support me, you can always subscribe, hit the little bell button. And if you really, really want to support me, you can support me on Locals at younganglican.locals.com. Otherwise, and including, thank you for watching. God bless. Have a great day.